Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Surgical Safety and Surgical Site Infection Prevention. All lines have been placed on a listen-only mode, and the floor will be open for questions and comments following the presentation. If you should require assistance throughout the conference, please press star 0 on your telephone keypad to reach a live operator. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to your host, Patrick Nielsen. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kat. Hi, everyone. My name is Patrick Nielsen. I'm here with my teammate, Annette Handy, and the rest of our Indiana patient safety team. Thank you for joining us today for our Surgical Safety and Surgical Site Infection Prevention webinar. A few housekeeping things just to start us off. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the link will be sent along with the slide deck to the attendees within a few days, probably by the end of the week. Utilizing the chat feature, please type your name, title, and organization. If you have any questions regarding this webinar as well, please type that into the chat box. Polling questions are included within the presentation. If you're unable to use the voting feature, please utilize the chat to respond. All lines are open for comment. However, when you're not speaking, please place the telephone line on mute and not on hold, as we would love to hear your hold music. Today's probably not the day. So really appreciate it. Just to go over our mission is to engage and inspire healthcare providers to create safe cultures, create reliable systems of care, and to prevent patient harm in Indiana. The intent of this program is to advance the conversation among Indiana hospitals around surgical safety and preventative measures to avoid surgical site infections. So as this is our first polling question, should I click?
Nope.
Okay.
Kat will open it up.
Just on the left, if you wouldn't mind saying which physician you are, and if it's an other, if you wouldn't mind typing that in on the bottom as well. Great, that's an amazing crowd. Wow, those are still coming in. Okay, thank you so much. Just keep typing on the chat box as well. We're about to go to the next slide. This is just a state of the state for surgical site infections. This includes colon, abdominal hysterectomies, total hip and total knee surgeries. This is also following the NHSN definitions. This is from all the HIN hospitals within the state of Indiana. As you can see, the orange line is the baseline period, so that is previous to October of 2016. And the green line is our improvement target throughout the HIN, which is a 20% reduction. This graph right here shows the abdominal hysterectomy. You can tell where the baseline started on the left as it goes to the right. This is a month-to-month look at it, so this isn't the rate changing overall. This is just a month-to-month. And here you can see the total hips and knees. You can see a lot more variance within these two graphs just because there are less participating hospitals entering this data, so the number changes pretty drastically from month to month. And with that, I would like to pass it to Annette Handy to talk about colon SSIs.
Thanks, Patrick, and welcome everybody. We're going to be doing a lot of just basic global surgical safety discussions today, but we're going to be focusing on colon SSIs because we heard from our partners that was just kind of a sticky wicket for a lot of folks. And so we wanted to give some attention to that particular procedure. And so I wanted to share with you how our Indiana HIN hospitals have been performing with colon-specific surgery. So as Patrick mentioned in the earlier graphs, the orange line is our baseline period, which for the state of Indiana was 5.33%. So our improvement goal, which would be the green, because we want to go green, would be a 20% reduction or 4.26. I will tell you that throughout the HEN, this monitoring period, we've been as high as a state aggregate as 7.57 and as low as 3.52. So you can see that we have had a couple months where we did dip below that goal. So it is attainable, but there's just something that we need to advance this conversation, thus why you're joining us today. I also wanted to share with you, now we do know that not all organizations will have a calculated SIR rate within NHSN, but as you can see, our state SIR is above the HHS goal where we would like to be for these particular procedures. So with that background, I'm so thrilled and excited to introduce our friend Barb DeBon, who is an improvement advisor with Sinosure Health. I'm not going to spend time giving you her wonderful bio, but when you do receive the slide deck, her bio is linked within this slide. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Barb.
Well, thank you, Annette, and thank you, Patrick, for that nice overview. I'm so delighted that you introduced me as your friend, because that's the way I feel about the state of Indiana. I've had the opportunity to partner with you on numerous occasions, and I am never left anything other than inspired. So it's a delight to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation we're going to have today. So just to kind of frame where we're at, for those of us, and it was interesting, I always love to do those polls to see who's with us today, because clearly the majority of attendees that are listening in today are infection preventionists. And the infection preventionists, and that's what I'm one of you, so I've been an infection preventionist for most of my career, and we lean so heavily on the HCPAC guidelines, the CDC HCPAC guidelines. And if we think about SSI prevention, the first guidelines that were issued by this committee were back in 1999, and most of the things that were in that document were really driven by expert opinion and not necessarily randomized controlled studies. So for those of us that work in this space, we had bated breath waiting for these 2017 new guidelines to be released because we were so excited that we were going to finally get some updated information and be able to share with our peri-op partners to forward the cause and to make things better in this arena. And so just a little bit of a background is this team, they reviewed more than 5,000 studies that were published between 1998 and 2014. So we're thinking, well, that's a lot of great data. They must have gotten a lot of great stuff, and they're going to have a lot of great recommendations for us. But as it turned out, and this was really about the shift in terms of how the HCPAC group now looks at data. They completely changed how they do it. So it's no longer expert opinion, but it's really weighted based on the evidence. And so the problem for most of us is that there are not very many high-quality randomized controlled studies in this space, especially of recent times, for the HCPAC group to be able to say, absolutely, there's a strong recommendation for this. So most of what the committee was able to come up with ended up being no recommendations or unresolved issues, which was discouraging for those of us that were anxiously hoping to be able to get some better guidance or to be able to say, hey, yeah, this works. Look at this. This is the way we should be doing things. But if we appreciate the fact that there's still a lot of quote-unquote no recommendations, unresolved issues, it doesn't mean that we still shouldn't look at what's out there, listen to current best practices, and learn from our peers. So that's kind of the upside of the evolution of the HCPAC guidelines. So when I first started discussing this potential webinar with Annette and Patrick, we were saying, well, you know, it would be just really, really great. To me, there is no better way to frame a discussion than to feature a local hospital, a hospital that's actually in the state. So my hope, and I nicknamed Patrick our talent scout. That's his new title. He's the talent scout. And I said, okay, Patrick, it's your job. Get out there and go find me a peri-op team that we can interview and learn from and feature them on this webinar. So luckily, Patrick came through and found us St. Vincent's, Indianapolis. which is an almost 800-bed acute care hospital. And I had the pleasure of being introduced to the team, and you're seeing their faces here on this slide. So we have Lindsay, who is the quality coordinator of surgical services. We have Dr. Mark Edwards, who's the chief of surgery, and we have Kelly Pitcock, who is the vice president of surgical services. So you see their faces, you're about to hear their voices, and they're going to take some time sharing some of their journey with us and giving us some really concrete nuggets that we can take back to our facility and start to explore. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the team to tell us a little bit about how you developed this team structure. Were there any roadblocks? Were there any hiccups? Were there any challenges? Was this perfect out of the gate, or did it evolve over time? So I'd like to hear from the team how this all happened.
All right, thank you very much. This is Kelly Pitcock, Vice President of Surgical Services at St. Vincent, Indianapolis. And yes, we did have hiccups and gaps and barriers as we went through this work. I think our journey started about 3 years ago when I was new to my role, and I was partnered with Dr. Edwards, who's our chief of surgery. And around that time, we also were lucky enough to have Lindsay Ambler, our quality coordinator for surgical services, join our team. And I think our starting point was really when we started to look at our data and see where we actually fell and made a decision that we were not happy with where our outcomes were. So we formed this committee. You can see the committee members and the structure on this slide. What we focused on mimicking this structure after some organizational structure that was already in place. We have groups called hacker groups, which are hospital-acquired condition executive review teams. And we kind of tried to structure for our colon, our SSI prevention in the same way. So when we first started, I think some lessons learned is we did not have the OR specialty coordinator as part of the team, nor did we have our general surgery resident director. And as we started pulling the team together and evaluating the data, we realized that those two team members were really important to be added to make sure that we had some frontline associates that were able to give us feedback and help impact the changes that we wanted to make. Another important piece of this is this team was responsible and fell under a larger hacker group for the organization. So Lindsay, Dr. Edwards, and myself were responsible for presenting at an organization level the work of this group, our results. And I think the big benefit is we were able to communicate any barriers that we were having so that our executive team could help eliminate those barriers so that we could move forward quickly.
So that's a great overview, Kelly. And I'm going to put Dr. Edwards on the spot because I want to ask him a question right out of the gate. I see that you're listed here as Chief of Surgery. So that's you in that box on the left. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That's you. So yes. How important, for those of us that are listening, how important is it to have the Chief of Surgery fully being a complete 100% champion of this work? And what would you say to people that are listening today that may not have those characteristics in this person in this little box? What are your tips?
Well, and I don't know that every hospital has the, quote, chief of surgery or not, but I think you can identify a champion even if there's not within the group, the hysterectomy group, the colon surgery group. But I think it's very important that the person in my position be engaged and be a leader in practicing what we preach. And I think that's leading by example is probably more important than leading by edict.
Thank you. Dr. Edwards, I knew that was what you were going to share with us because we discussed this earlier, but I wanted everybody listening today to hear those words because I think what you're saying is that it's not necessarily the title of the person, but it's the engagement and the behavior and the modeling the behavior that is so critical. So it may not be your chief of surgery who's the executive sponsor. It may be somebody else. So it's not about the title. it's about the person and the characteristics. So thank you for sharing that with us. So back to the team, yes. Can you tell us about, can you kind of pull apart this chart and speak through what we're seeing on this graph, which is your colon SSIs from 2015 to 2017?
Yes, so this is Lindsay. I'm the quality coordinator for surgical services here. What this graph is showing is really when we started our journey in 2015 of deep diving all of our colon SSI events through 2017. What you see is observed is our raw number of infections. The expected bar is the expected total number for NHSN for us for that calendar year, and then the green bar is our SIR or our rate. So what you're seeing is that we've had a dramatic decline over the last 3 years. I can tell you we don't have 2018 on this slide, but we ended calendar year 2018 with 2 total surgical site infections for the entire calendar year for colon. So we have stayed on pace and sustained our improvements.
So, Lindsay, when you first started doing your deep diving into your cases, and we're going to get to that in greater detail, was that your burning platform? Was it your observation that you had more patients developing colon surgical site infections than were predicted? Was that shocking, or was that something that just helped to mobilize the team?
I think that was both. I think it was shocking and something that helped to mobilize the team. I think that it was about this time in 2015 that it was really becoming common knowledge, the NHSN system and the surveillance of the SSIs, the colon and hysterectomy surgical site infections becoming targets for payer programs for hospitals. And so it was in 2015 with that observed and expected and that rate above 1 that you see there, we did as a hospital lose points on our Anthem scorecard. So that sort of created the fire beneath, we have to get boots on the ground.
Yeah, so it's really important to be able to look at this data and say, yep, this is what mobilized us, but then take a moment and look at what you've been able to achieve with it, which is really, truly remarkable. And to know that you've only had 2 cases in 2018, really incredibly great results. Can you speak to this, too, to give us a little bit more information? So we looked at a SIR, which is a ratio, and now we're looking at a rate.
Yes, so what this is, and Patrick and Annette put this together for us, but this is over time looking at our number of events per month compared to total number of denominator cases that were entered into NHSN. So what you're seeing there is for essentially most of 2018, we had 0 surgical site infections. We had 1 in January, which you see that blip, and then we had 1 in December, which is that last blip on the end. So those are those 2. So this is a rate compared to our volume per month.
Okay. So I'm curious to know, because I know a lot of us that are listening today, traditionally we reported our infections as rates. And, the shift to a standardized infection ratio where, there was a real pushback in the beginning. People didn't understand it. And I'm going to put this back on Dr. Edwards because I want to hear from you about, as a surgeon, what was your reaction when hospitals or when your particular hospital changed from reporting just rates to ratios, and whether or not there was, whether it was an improvement in your mind or if it was something that was potentially misleading?
Well, all surgeons fear change, and so change all by itself is bothersome. And the ratio, I think it's taken a long time for us to figure out the ratio aspect. Rates are easy for us to understand. The ratios are a bit of a challenge. But I think everyone is working with Lindsay she helps us understand the ratio.
Well, I really appreciate your candor, and I think your description is so spot on, because we can get tied up in the rates and the ratios. And what I really want to just bring us back to is what we're looking at right now. We're looking at a chart with a bunch of dots, and every single dot really is a person, is a patient, is somebody that had surgery that developed an infection. So I would like to know whether or not you ever, when you're discussing your data, if you just exactly what you said, Lindsay, do you drill it down to numbers rather than rates and ratios and say, we had 2 patients? So tell us more about that.
So when we share the data at the different tables and levels that we share it, we always share with them the raw number of events that we had, and then we also share with them our SIR. I think when Dr. Edwards and I started this journey of attending meetings and sharing, we got a little bit, and I'm sure hospitals like us probably hear the same tune. Kind of your first response back from your surgeons when you're showing them a ratio and your data doesn't look so good is kind of the we're special mentality, but we're a trauma facility, but we're a tertiary care center, but. And so what Dr. Edwards and I tried really hard to do was to change the mindset, to your point, that each one of those blue dots is a patient who experienced a surgical site infection. And until we reach a point that we could go in and look in each one of those cases and decide that we did everything within our power to prevent that infection, that we had work to do.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. And just in summary, Dr. Edwards, thank you for saying what you said about surgeons fearing change. But you know what? You're not the only ones. Surgeons fear change, but so do most of us that work in healthcare. And it can be really kind of terrifying when we shift the way that we collect data and display it, and suddenly people are completely befuddled by it. So I really like bringing it home to what you're doing, which is the raw number, is the how many lives were touched, how many people were impacted, or even more importantly, how many people didn't get impacted. You know, how many people would you have predicted would have developed a surgical site infection based on your SIR predictions, and how many didn't, to be able to celebrate the things that didn't happen. So I applaud you for recognizing that all data has its limitations. There's pluses and minuses, but it seems like you do a really nice job focusing on the variety of ways to share it.
Hey, Barb, this is Annette, and before you move on, there is a related question in the chat that I wanted to ask the team. From LaWanda Jones, she wants to know, does that total number of SSIs include superficial infections also?
So when we report those out, I report out, so kind of the way we do it, we tell our surgeons all the infections that we had as a raw number. That includes our superficials and our PATOs, which is our present at time of surgery. We then share with them the raw number of events that actually counted towards our CMS SIR and as our target on the Anthem scorecard, and then we show the SIR. So we kind of show all 3 of those. Does that answer the question?
I think it does. Yes. I think Annette might have gone back on mute.
Okay.
No, thank you.
And Annette and Patrick, I'm going to trust that you can see the chat box with questions, because I am not seeing it for some reason, and I'm afraid to touch anything on my screen for fear that I will go into cyberspace. So
Same here.
I will pause periodically and let you jump in with questions, especially since it's nice to ask them when they're more relevant. So is there anything else in the chat box that we need to know about?
As of right now, no. I think everything's good.
Okay. All right. I'll try to take a breath in between my moving on here, so we give you plenty of time to ask your questions. And so I'd like to move it back to the team to tell us a little bit about your gap analysis and how did you do it and why did you do it?
So this is Lindsay, where we started, as Kelly mentioned a little bit earlier, our hacker structure that we already had in the hospital, when we started doing this work, we already had work groups that existed in that hacker structure that were looking at CAUTI and CLABSI. And so my kind of first approach was to go and see what they were doing, because what they had done had already proven successful for us as a hospital with reducing our CLABSI and CAUTI rates. And so I really mimicked my gap analysis to reflect the same type of gap analysis that those tables were doing. And what that led to is us adopting, approving an evidence-based bundle of care geared towards colon SSI prevention. And then what we started to do, Dr. Edwards and myself would review all of our surgical site infections and compare that to our bundle each individual data point. Either we met it or we did not meet it within that case. And then on a monthly basis, when our team met, that team that Kelly shared on the first slide, what I would do is I would trend each data point for our team. And so we could see within the infections that were actually occurring where we were having the most opportunity compared to what evidence-based practice was telling us we should be doing. And that very quickly identified for us our 3 biggest action items that we were going to share with you guys today.
Great. So what Lindsay just described is a phenomenal way to do it, is to say, okay, these are the expectations. These are the things that we expect we're going to see in our patients. Let's find the things that are not reliably happening so that we know where to start. Otherwise, you're just, you're swinging in the dark. So the fact that you looked at your evidence-based care, you looked at your bundle, you did an analysis, and you looked for trends and you looked for themes, and then at least knew where to start. So before I let you take the first, the big observation, we have another polling question, because we'd like to know, for those of you that are listening, who on your team is responsible for documenting or assigning the wound class for each surgical case? Is it the surgeon or is it the nurse? And it looks like, and if it's other, please chat it in and let us know. Looks like they're coming in slowly but surely. Give this another moment here. We had surgeons in the lead, but it looks like nursing has gone ahead. Let's see. All right. So we're probably going to still have a few more dribbling in, but it looks like the majority are where nursing is responsible for assigning the wound class, followed by the surgeon. So it looks like almost 60% are nursing, 40% are surgeons. So that's good for us to hear, and it's good for our team to hear, because what we're going to do now is turn it back to the team to tell us about the gaps that you identified, and specifically the first one.
Okay, this is Kelly. Through the identifying the gaps that Lindsay just spoke to, upon analysis of our events, we determined that 7 out of 10 of our SSIs in 2015 actually had an incorrect wound classification, and that was a big aha to us. That wasn't something that we were by any means expecting to see. We identified this by comparing the procedural notes to the American College of Surgeon wound classification definitions. During that time, the wound classification was documented by the circulator in the room, and wasn't formally there wasn't a formality of any part of the case. Our first step was to try to include that at the end of the case huddle to make sure that the circulator was having and verifying with the surgeon what the wound class was, but we quickly found out that we didn't see the change or the results that we needed to.
So as a result of your observations, what was your plan and how did that happen?
So basically, Dr. Edwards and our team determined that the wound classification should actually be a surgeon documentation requirement. So we removed that from the nursing documentation and included it in our immediate post-op note that is now, of course, a mandatory field in our EHR.
So, Dr. Edwards, you thought it was a better idea for the surgeons to do the assessment of the wound classification. And tell us all how you enlightened your partners, your surgical partners, to feel the same way that you did.
Well, again, we have a general surgery section meeting periodically, often monthly, and where we can share information like this. And it became clear that there was a communication gap where when nursing was required to make the wound classification, we didn't always see that there was a communication between the surgeon and the nurse, circulating nurse in the room. And we were close to a point where we were going to change from paper documentation of the immediate postoperative note to electronic health record documentation, and we thought that was a good time to make the change. And it was actually fairly seamless. We included on our immediate post-procedure note, under the place to check the wound classification, we have the American College of Surgeons definitions in boxes below. So it's available each time the surgeon assigns a wound classification.
So not only do you make it hard to do the wrong thing, you make it easier to do the right thing, and you put the responsibility in the hands of the individual that has the best bird's eye view of the wound and the experience, and is the best person to judge what the wound class is. That pretty accurate? Am I summarizing that okay?
I think you're right. It's the person at the field. It's the person who saw the patient preoperatively. It's the person who knows the history in detail. And I think that's the person that should be classifying the wound. Now, if there's a formal communication between the surgeon and the nurse, I could see that could work, but it just seemed easier for us to have the physician do it.
Well, it certainly seems like it's making a great difference. So I think that for those of us that are listening in today, this is something that we can take back and take a pulse and figure out what we're doing in our own facilities. Obviously, the reason it's so important to categorize the wound class accurately is because we're going to penalize ourselves. We're going to look worse than we are if we're calling something a clean case, if it's not really a clean case. So because we know that the associated risks of infection are much higher with a dirty case versus a clean case. So it just makes so much sense to be able to say, yeah, let's just get this documented right, and then we can be more confident that our data is more accurate. And Kelly and Lindsay, when we spoke a little while ago, we spoke a little bit about having some keywords that were part of the prompt, so that if a certain word popped up, it wouldn't be possible. So, for example, if abscess or perforated popped up, it wouldn't be possible for somebody to categorize the case as a clean or clean contaminated. Can you speak a little bit more about this and the value of this sort of a process?
So we did a lot of education with our surgeons around the American College of Surgeons wound classification and these keywords, and our message to them was really, if you're in your dictation of the procedure, if you're going to use any of these words, that should be what's guiding your wound classification. So that helped a lot with just an understanding from the surgeon perspective of what the intent of the wound classification and what that means. Barb, you brought up when we briefed earlier this week, you have some surgeons who might fear classifying their wound into a contaminated or a dirty with a misunderstanding that might be them saying that they broke sterile technique or some of those type variables, where it's really, when you look at the chart and the classification, it's really geared more towards what's happening inside the patient at that time.
Yeah, it's something that I've heard from so many of my colleagues who say exactly as you described, is that it's not a reflection on your surgical technique. It's a reflection on the condition of the wound. So it doesn't mean that you dropped something or contaminated the wound. It just means, so it's not a reflection on you and your personal technique. It's a reflection on what the wound is actually, what's going on in the wound, whether it's clean or dirty or somewhere in between. So thanks for remembering to bring that up, because I think it's a really important distinction. So wound classification, we're going to move on to the next gap that this team identified. But first, let's find out from all of us that are on the call today. Tell us, we have hardwired practices to assure that the administration, we have the right antibiotic, it's weight-based, and it's re-administered if the case goes longer than we anticipate. So tell us if you've got these hardwired. Yes, if you do, and no, if you don't. And looks like a lot of people immediately jumped all over yes. Looks like we've got a great majority of respondents saying that yes, we've hardwired it. We've got the right antibiotic. We're making sure we're given enough based on a patient's BMI or weight, body weight. And yes, if the case goes longer than expected, we're going to redose, because we know that these antibiotics don't stay circulating for as long as we wish that they did. So back to the team. Tell us about gap number 2.
So when we started to look, about the same time that we started to look at our surgical site infections in late 2015, We are part of a national healthcare system, Ascension Health, and there were some newer guidelines from our national antimicrobial stewardship on surgical prophylaxis with antibiotics. Those recommendations, I'm sure, will sound familiar to most of you, that for colon surgery, your surgical prophylaxis is cefazolin and Flagyl prior to cut. What we found when we started looking at our events was truly a lack of standardization across the board. The most common thing that we found in our infection cases was the use of the antibiotic cefoxitin. What made having our clinical pharmacist part of this group so integral was she was able to share with our surgeons from a pharmacy perspective why cefoxitin wasn't a good choice. It has a very short half-life. It was recommended that if we were going to use that antibiotic, that it be redosed every 2 hours versus the standard for cefazolin of every 4. And as we started to communicate that our standard of care would be cefazolin and Flagyl with redosing of cefazolin Q4 and then the cefazolin being weight-based for the patient, we started to see some of these things in use, but not always completely compliant with the bundle. So I would see cefazolin, but not the addition of Flagyl. I would see them both given, but not redosed as appropriate. And so what we would do is each time we would take those individual cases right back to that surgeon and re-educate with the event that this was our standard and this is what they needed to be doing. We also did some things as a hospital to make it hard to do the wrong thing. So we actually pulled cefoxitin off of formulary and completely out of our operating room pharmacy. So it was impossible to administer cefoxitin for us.
What you just said is so practical and so important, but so infrequently done. Is like, just take it away. Don't make it easy for somebody to order the wrong medication. So.
I think that gets back to when we speak of when Kelly kicked us off with our team structure. Our clinical pharmacist, as part of this work, was so invaluable. She was a really key member of this group, and that's someone that can help you make those sorts of changes very quickly when you bring them to the table.
Well, I would just say, in honor of all the pharmacists out there, either listening today or out there doing their work, I have, in the last, especially couple of years, become more and more appreciative of the value that clinical pharmacists bring to the table, not only with things like this, but just with antibiotic stewardship in general. And some of the best antibiotic stewardship programs that I've seen across the country are pharmacy-driven, and a lot of them are in places that don't even have an infectious disease specialist or doctor. So, kudos to the clinical pharmacists out there that are really driving the train and making a really big difference.
I just, real quick, as a side note to this, I know this call is specific to colon, but here at Indy, another example of something we saw when we looked at our hysterectomy surgical site infections, which we've struggled with getting under control at the same level as we have with colon. But what we identified was several of our hysterectomy surgical site infections had some bowel involvement, and most of them were occurring in our GYN oncology patient population. So that was where we added our GYN oncology surgeons to be part of this work, and we actually made the decision with infectious disease signing off on it, that we would do the same surgical prophylaxis for GYN oncology hysterectomies as we do for our colon cases, and that is the cefazolin and the Flagyl, and we implemented that in February of 2018, and we have not had a hysterectomy SSI since we made that decision.
Well, that's
the way that this group kind of piggybacked onto another group.
Well, and I think that's a great way of showing spread and showing that, if you're doing procedures and you can anticipate that there's going to be bowel involvement, and it makes sense that you, again, predict that it's going to happen and assume that it will, and then prepare for it. So I think I'm so glad you shared that, because that was something that we hadn't discussed. So thank you.
And just real quick, Dr. Edwards wanted me to make sure that I did mention, we do also have recommendations for patients with allergies. So we have standardization as well if we do have patients that have allergies.
Allergies to drugs, to medication?
Yes, correct.
Good. Good, good. Well, we're learning more and more about that and how many people think they're allergic to certain groups of antibiotics and they're not. So it's exciting to hear that we're doing more focus on that to be able to recognize that we've got to figure out how do we give the most effective but least problematic antibiotic that's going to hopefully prevent the infection but not drive the emergence of resistance, which is what we're trying to achieve. So thank you for sharing that too. Can you speak a little bit about, this is an expansion part of the GAP, is the bowel prep and how this has come to be with your experience?
Yeah, this is Edwards again. In the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a lot of talk about eliminating oral antibiotics as part of a mechanical bowel prep. There was a lot of talk, and still some scattered around, of doing no bowel prep for elective colon surgery. I was one of those who dropped the oral antibiotics and noticed pretty impressively that I had a significant spike in superficial wound infections. And then some data came out, a paper from Louisville was the most recent that I had read, that indicated that the results were much better with the addition of oral antibiotics to a mechanical bowel prep. And so that's one of the things we also found in some evidence-based studies elsewhere. And we've tried to standardize that, and I believe everyone now does a form of oral antibiotic in addition to mechanical bowel prep. We've also looked at some additional things intraoperatively that may not be included on here, but a wound protector for all cases has become pretty standardized, and I think we're intermittent in how we irrigate the subcutaneous tissues at the completion of the case, but some of us have even started doing pulse lavage irrigations at the end of the case. And I think all these little things help to some degree. Nothing by itself may show a big effect, but the addition of all these we think has helped significantly.
Well, Dr. Edwards, I'm going to challenge you because earlier in this discussion you said that surgeons don't like change, but you just showed that, yes, they can change. And so you are a perfect example of somebody that, that is the way we used to do it. And, I stopped using those oral antibiotics, but then guess what? I realized that my results aren't that great. And maybe we should really revisit this because there's some new data and new learning. So we couldn't ask for a better spokesperson than you to say that, yeah, we used to do it this way, but we have new knowledge and it's a new day and we're moving on. So I think it was just very refreshing to hear you say that.
Well, we try to be self-aware.
Well, I think self-awareness, especially in your arena, is so important and so critical. And when we're not, we rely on each other to let us know when we've missed something or messed something up or contaminated something. So I think that that's a great comment about we need to be self-aware, but we have to be aware of others, and we have to feel safe speaking up when we see something that's either been neglected or forgotten. So I think that summarized your plan. Is there anything else you wanted to add to this discussion about your current prep, your current regimen?
I think at the end you will have a copy of our entire bundle. I think one of the lessons I learned from Dr. Edwards, we started to look at the bundle. I think, to your point, that surgeons don't like to change, but they also are very influenced by evidence. Most of our surgeons are very thoughtfully reviewing the literature on a regular basis, and they want to go in the direction that the evidence is guiding them. One of Dr. Edwards' words of caution when we first started this work, because I can tend to be pie in the sky, let's conquer the world in a day type mentality, and his lesson was, the problem with bundles is if you throw everything in the kitchen sink at a problem, when you fix it, you don't know specifically what worked. And so we did a very thoughtful implementation of just a couple of things at a time and prioritized, based on what we were seeing in our own data, what to implement when, so that when we saw the decrease in our infections, we would know what it was that was working and impacting our patients.
Yeah, your point is so important. I think that's why we struggle so much with the lack of randomized controlled studies, because we can't stop doing things that we know work to test something new, and so often we think that something made the difference, and I think that's kind of the power of the bundle, is when you do a lot of things that have got evidence and you do them all consistently and reliably, we tend to get better results. So that's a great reminder that you just shared with us. So I want to move us on to this next polling question, because we're curious to know, for everybody that's with us today, how are you sharing your surgical site infection results? Do you do a lot of data collection, and do you discuss it at committee meetings? Do you collect the data, and do you make sure that all the stakeholders, including the surgeons, especially the surgeons, get to see it? Or do you kind of keep it pretty private, pretty protected, and not display it? So it looks like we've got the majority are collecting it and sharing it in committees, and then yay! They just went ahead. This is like a little derby race here. Okay, so it looks like we have a 50. I thought we had a 50-50 tie, but it looks like it's really close. It looks like the majority are collecting data and sharing it in meetings, followed closely by collecting data and sharing with stakeholders. So this is something that we're all challenged by. And to your point that you made just a moment ago, is that surgeons are very much like a lot of other clinicians in that they're very, very driven by data. So Dr. Edwards, let me ask you this question. If you were to see data about surgical site infections in your hospital, when you see it, do you know who the other players are, or is it blinded, or is it transparent? Do you get compared to your peers, and if so, what does that look like?
We do get compared to our peers. We're given our report card periodically, but we're blinded as to who the other people are. We're the only one who knows who we are and no one else.
So if you saw that you weren't faring as well as somebody else, would you be able to find out who that person was that was getting really great results and go have a conversation with that person to find out why?
I think so, with a little bit of work, but more importantly, we could discuss it. We have a peer review the same time we have our section meeting, so it's a fairly protected environment, and so we're pretty comfortable discussing all these issues at that time.
Good. I would like to hear more about that at another time, because I think there's the evidence that I've heard in the discussions I've had with my peers is that it's the peer power of knowing that if you have a colleague who's getting significantly better results than you are, then I'd sure want to know why. I'd want to know how that person is getting to where they need to be. So I'm going to move it back to the team for a summary of some of your communication tips and tricks for how this is actually rolled out, and more about notifying people in your facility. So let's let you take it from here, team.
So this is Kelly. Yeah, our communication is that we report out our data. We have monthly surgical governance council meetings that we report all of our SSIs. Then we have the hacker group that I mentioned earlier. This slide shows the who's on that group. You can see that we have, with our quarterly report out, we report out to the Vice President of Quality and Safety. Our CNO and our CMO lead that group, and then they keep a stoplight report to help us keep on track with our action plans and remove any barriers that we're having. And then I think a big piece that we haven't touched on is for every SSI that's reviewed, there is a surgeon notification. So there's a letter that goes from Dr. Edwards to the surgeon notifying the surgeon about their SSI, and then it also includes the review of the case and any gaps are identified or any variances from the bundle.
And we send that letter. That is not something we do via email. Dr. Edwards felt pretty strongly that to underscore the importance, we actually type that letter, he signs it with a wet signature, and we mail that to their office.
Yeah, that's a really great approach. So few things come in the mail with a stamp these days that when they do, they tend to get much more attention and it carries a greater degree of importance, I think, when somebody actually takes the time to type out a letter, print it, and have an actual inked signature on it. It makes it a lot more real than something that looks like it's just a kind of a standard email that goes out to the universe. So that's a really great suggestion, and I'm going to take that forward and use that as a great example of ways to communicate. Anything else on communication before we move on?
Okay. I don't think so.
Okay, good. So we're not going to get into EROS or enhanced recovery after surgery. This is more of a teaser for the next time we all get together. But this is something that's gaining traction, recognizing that there's so much, especially with patient-family engagement, that can take place before surgery, getting people involved during surgery, recognizing the importance of how we manage our patients after care. So we're going to get into this more when we meet again. And then this is just a reference for those that are interested in more information about EROS, a nice overview of the clinical benefits and some really nice how-tos. So we're going to wrap up in just a bit, but we've got one last polling question. We want to know what your team does, your colorectal team, and read these carefully so you know what we're asking. Do you, at the end of the surgery, when the patient's colon has been sewed up and you're about to close the patient, does your team change gloves and then use instruments, either a new fresh kit or instruments that are on a separate Mayo stand for closing, or you don't change gloves but they do use new instruments, or you do not use new instruments for closing, but you do change gloves? So I know these are kind of complex chances, or you're not sure what they do. And I'm actually very pleased to see that there are 8 people now on the call that are not sure what they do, because this is something that you can go back to your facilities and find out whether or not any of these practices are taking place. It looks like the majority are changing gloves and are using instruments that are either fresh, brand new, sterile, not opened yet instruments, or they've been on a designated Mayo stand, so they were not used in the surgery, the part of the surgery where the instruments were highly contaminated because of the contact with the bowel contents. So this is a really important thing to think about with regards to colorectal surgery. I'm hearing more and more discussion in the literature and just on listservs and just in the community about the benefits of doing these kinds of practices, recognizing that at the end of these kinds of surgeries, there's a lot of contamination, and it's an example of the bundle that Lindsay mentioned that I'm going to show you in just a moment. But I want to close and just kind of summarize our discussion very quickly. I'd like to just comment on the team's gap analysis, which is so incredibly important, because if we don't do a gap analysis, we really don't know what we're missing. And team, I'm delighted, I'm sure you were delighted to find that you found some stuff, because if you were having SSIs and you looked at your charts and you couldn't find any gaps, what would you have done next?
Thankfully, we didn't have to answer that question. But that does kind of get back to the statement I made earlier, and every time we start a meeting to review our SSIs, we start it with the message that until we can look at every single case where there was an SSI and truly believe that we did everything in our power to prevent it, we have work to do.
Yeah, great response. I love it. Everybody go back and look at your wound classification process, find out who's doing it. If the nurses are doing it, I would say take Dr. Edwards' message back to them and say it really should be the surgeon. The surgeon is the one that's got the best assessment of the wound. It's not an evaluation of their technique, it's an evaluation of the wound. Go back and find out what are your practices regarding antibiotics. Are you using the right antibiotic? Are you using the right doses? Are you giving an additional dose if you need to because of surgery length of time? The team did a really nice job describing the bowel prep and how important it is to think about the combination of mechanical, oral, a combination. It's not just one way to get to the bugs that are in there and most likely to cause harm. And then the team really did a beautiful job about communication and how communication, and let me just ask you guys, communication in general, would you say that is the most important driver of success in the perioperative field?
Yes, I would think so. I think that part of our success was that we have a really great team that works really well together, and kind of any suggestions not off the table. Yeah, and the courage to speak up when something doesn't look right or something looks a little off. And then finally, again, and these are all the things that we really would like for those of you that are listening in today to go back and assess. Be prepared to share some of the things that you discovered when we get together again, because this is where we're all going to be able to come back and say, wow, yeah, I didn't know that we did this, or boy, I'm sure glad I went back and discovered this. So the next time when we get together, we're going to have a little bit more time to get into some of the details, but the St. Vincent team has graciously offered to share their nice 2-pager of bundle elements, and Annette and Patrick will send that out with the slides from this presentation sometime in the next couple of days, I believe. And this is just a summary of some of the bundle elements that St. Vincent team described. It's not inclusive, but it's just some examples of some of the pre, intra, and post-operative strategies that we know make a difference in how well people do after surgery. And then next time we're going to dive into a little bit more about antimicrobial prophylaxis, but we do want to get into a discussion about glycemic control, normothermia, whether or not oxygenation is something that people are using routinely, and then a little bit about antiseptic prophylaxis, so skin cleaning and surgical skin prep. So we're going to get into that in a little bit the next time we get together. So, Annette, I'm going to let you take the next couple of slides and just summarize what's coming up and what we've got to look forward to.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Barb, and thank you so much to the team from St. Vincent, Indianapolis. We're just better together, and peer learning is always so helpful. As Barb has alluded to during today's presentation, we just knew that there was so much great information that we couldn't squeeze it into 1 hour. So we're going to continue this conversation next month on Tuesday, March the 12th. So save the date and mark your calendars. We'll be sending out an Outlook calendar invitation as well shortly. And so as Barb mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit more about some cross-cutting interventions. Today we wanted to dedicate some special time to colon procedures, but again, just lots of rich information. Some things that we wanted you to be aware of, since your organization is a HIN participating hospital, we wanted you to be aware that there is a change package and a top 10 checklist that you might choose to utilize as a gap analysis. And so when we send out the slide deck, you'll be able to link to that. But if you're really fired up and you want to do that yet today, you can visit hret-hiin.org, and under the Topics tab, you can select surgical site infections. Also, I know we just love Barb so much. We had to make sure that you all knew that through HRET they have created a SSI podcast series, and so 2 of the 3 have been posted, and you can visit those through these hyperlinks, as well as going to the hret-hin.org website and access there. So really excited about these short, sweet, and really full of valuable information. And so finally, before we wrap things up, we wanted to give a shout out to our APIC Indiana friends that their spring conference is just around the corner, April 26th. From 7 to 3 p.m. And so, again, within the slide deck, you'll be able to click on this hyperlink and get some more details. I don't know that registration is open yet, but if you're an infection preventionist or you have a passion for this type of work, we really encourage you to reach out to your regional peers because there's some amazing work happening within this professional organization. And then finally, we just wanted to share with you the contact information for the Indiana Patient Safety Center team. We're here to support you, and we also have the tremendous privilege to connect you with amazing folks like St. Vincent, Indianapolis, as well as Barb DeBon, who's joined us today. So in closing, I'll just ask if you have any final comments, Barb, before we wrap it up.
Just a huge thanks to the St. Vincent team. It's that your teamwork is palpable, and it was just a real inspiration to hear your story and your courage and your determination. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and we know that there's a lot more stories out there. So please, Patrick and I would love to harvest your SSI adventures, if you will, so that we can perhaps spotlight you in the future so that you can also be a mentor and share your lessons learned. So with that, we're going to give you back your day, and thank you for all that you do to help make Indiana a safer place.
Thank you. This does conclude today's conference. We thank you for your participation. You may disconnect your lines at this time and have a wonderful day.